After years of the same total drama flair, Ridonkulous Race brought new life and excitement into the long-running series. Bringing back the globetrotting aspect from Total Drama World Tour, the Ridonkulous Race took its 18 pairs of contestants on an unforgettable international adventure.
Good day, mates. Mind if I join in, yeah?
With a race as crazy as this one, there would be crazy challenges. But which of these challenges were fun and not too harmful, and which ones were brutal and insane? Yo, I'm Brad with Wicked Binge, and this is Ridonkulous Race Challenges, gruesome to most gruesome. But performing dangerous challenges on a reality show isn't the only way to make money. In fact, today's sponsor, Opinion Outpost, can help with that. Everybody likes money, and Opinion Outpost can help you earn extra cash in one of the coolest ways possible, just by sharing your opinion. I mean, you've got opinions, right? Why not monetize them? You literally get paid just from sharing your opinions on a number of topics, and can convert your earnings directly to your PayPal account, or even get an Amazon gift card if you want to get something awesome, like this inflatable sloth, or these Nicolas Cage pillowcases. It's so simple. You can earn extra money while you're binging our YouTube videos. If that sounds like a win, make sure to click the link in our description below. Thank you, Opinion Outpost, for sponsoring this video. Like with our other Total Drama Challenges videos, those same rules apply. If a challenge has 2 or more parts, we're taking all the parts into consideration. This includes looking at both parts of the either-or type challenges. Like the title implies, challenges will be ranked on their difficulty as well as how much pain or discomfort they could cause. Starting off with the easiest challenge, we have the Sahara Desert Challenge. This is the second challenge in the series and would be one of the easier ones. Contestants have to pick 5 spices from the spice kiosk. Afterwards, they had to ride a camel to a desert restaurant, and once there, they had to eat a stew made from the spices they chose. We're ranking this one as the easiest because while traveling through a desert and eating spicy food may be difficult, if you're someone who knows your spices or who actually likes eating spicy food, this challenge wouldn't be hard to complete.
My barf was actually less spicy than the stew!
Even riding on a camel, while uncomfortable and gross, would also be fun and not too different from riding on a horse. The worst consequence you can get from this challenge are burning taste buds, and even that's a maybe, depending on what spices you pick. Next is the Finland Challenge. Teams had to stay inside a sauna for 10 minutes before crossing a semi-frozen river. Then, the teammate who didn't perform the previous botch or watch had to perform on the air guitar in front of a live audience. This is another challenge that wouldn't be too painful and maybe even enjoyable. If you had to sit in a sauna fully clothed for 10 minutes, it isn't that bad. You'd be uncomfortable afterwards, especially if you fell into the ice, but it wouldn't be unbearable. What makes this challenge rank low is the air guitar portion. Unless you had stage fright like the twins, or were self-conscious like Noah, this portion would be easy, as long as you could properly let loose and rock out. The earlier portions may make this challenge more brutal, as going from extreme warmth to extreme cold can be dangerous, but we still view this challenge as more tolerable than gruesome. Moving on to the Paris Challenge. This challenge has one teammate draw a caricature of their partner.
Do you want to look alive in this?
Afterwards, teams had to navigate through the catacombs and find giant cheese wheels, which they then had to ride down a river before bringing it to the chill zone. The nice thing about caricatures is that even if you aren't the best artist, it doesn't matter much, since a caricature is all about exaggerated and silly features. In that sense, the first half of this challenge is easy. As for the catacombs, while it would be easy to get lost and all the skulls and rats aren't appealing, they don't present a sense of danger since there are no threats. As for sailing on a giant piece of cheese, this again isn't too bad, even if it would be a balancing act. While it's no romantic getaway in Paris, it's still a manageable challenge. Moving on to a spooky challenge. Next is the Transylvania Challenge. In this creepy Dracula-themed challenge, one teammate must push their partner, who's in a coffin, to a graveyard.
Take me to the grave digger.
After receiving their next tip, the other partner must then perform a perfect split on a balance beam and do a somersault onto a vault. Physical challenges like these are always tricky, but depending on a team's athleticism, it might not be too bad. Teams who had smaller or lightweight partners, or who were strong and had good stamina, wouldn't have too hard of a time with the first portion. As for the second, while more challenging, it's far from impossible since these are basic gymnastic moves. Again, having experience in gymnastics can give teams a huge advantage, making the latter half of this challenge seem like a walk in the park. Since not everybody has good upper body strength or decent gymnastic skills, we acknowledge that this challenge, especially the first half, can be difficult for some. Next, we have the Hawaii Challenge. One teammate has to dive into the ocean and collect a wedding ring. Afterwards, one teammate has to walk across hot coals while carrying their partner bridal style. This is far from the most dangerous water that a contestant on the Total Drama series has had to dive into. The dive is actually one of average size for once, instead of being insanely high. As for getting the rings, though maybe difficult to find, they aren't too hard to get, since they aren't guarded by anything. As for the hot goals, we will admit that would be harder and more brutal. Hence why we're ranking this challenge above the others we've already named.
You smell like smoked meat.
If a preteen like Junior can withstand the heat while carrying his dad, it can't be that bad. For that, we can't rank it any higher. Next is the Bahamas Challenge. Here we have another water and diving challenge. In this one, teams have to search for a treasure map in a local beach store. This isn't too bad, but maybe a little frustrating. Afterwards, one of the teammates had to scuba dive into the ocean and find treasure using the map they found during the first half of the challenge. Already, this is more difficult than the diving for wedding rings challenge. While the scuba gear helps with oxygen, it's still deeper and therefore a more dangerous dive. Having to search through an underwater sea cave is more difficult than searching a small lagoon, especially when a diver can easily get lost and run out of oxygen. Given that both Josie and Kitty nearly drowned in this challenge, we had to rank it fairly high. However, this was more due to mistakes on their part. Had it not been for Josie's hyperventilating and interference from an anglerfish, they would have likely been just fine. We're willing to acknowledge that it was still riskier than a normal dive. On to the Zimbabwe Challenge. Teams had to take a team selfie while falling over Victoria Falls.
Whatever.
Once at the bottom, they then had to find and take another selfie with a white rhinoceros. By the way, Victoria Falls is 354 feet high. Being asked to take a selfie while falling from something that high is insane. About as insane as walking up to a rhinoceros and trying to take a selfie with it. There are about a dozen things that could potentially go wrong, from drowning and broken bones to getting trampled. We don't envy any of these teams. While dangerous, it isn't brutal or gruesome as long as you're able to get a good picture right away. As such, we can't rank it any higher. Next is the Ontario Challenge. It's the very first challenge of the season. Teams had to either climb 144 flights of stairs or take the elevator and do a skywalk on a windy and dangerous ledge. Afterwards, they had to ride a zip line across Lake Ontario. The only reason this challenge is this high is the choice to climb 144 flights of stairs. In terms of more realistic, non-animated obstacles, that's about as brutal as it gets. However, what keeps it from being ranked any higher is the other choice, as well as the second half of the challenge. Doing a skywalk would be scary and dangerous, but it's still doable. Same with the zip line, which may be more of a relief after climbing stairs or taking a windy walk outside of the CN Tower. The stairs is optional, so this challenge loses gruesome points since half the teams didn't even have to do it. Just south of the border, we have the Mexico Challenge. One teammate must eat a pepper while the other jumps from a cliff to retrieve a tip, with the spiciness of the pepper eaten determining how high the jump is. Teams had to then ride burros 2 miles south to the chill zone. This is another diving challenge. However, with this one, both teammates have to deal with pain. You're either going to be eating a super hot pepper, or you're going to be jumping from an insane height. Pick your poison moment, and we're not sure which would be worse.
Can't handle the heat!
Because the mild peppers are an option and the water, surprisingly, isn't filled with sharks, this challenge isn't nearly as harsh as it could be. As for the burros, we'd compare them to the camels in the Sahara Challenge. Difficult to deal with, but not the most difficult. Moving on to the Geelong Challenge. Teams had to find a means to escape from a prison cell at a maximum security prison. Once out, they had to build a raft and sail to the chill zone. This one is certainly more mental than physical. While the teams are told the different options of escape, the teams had to search their cells and go through each of the options, which could be time-consuming. Some of the options are also much worse than others, like having to swim through a sewer underneath a cell toilet.
It stinks so bad down here.
Building a raft is also time-consuming and can be tough if you don't have experience with building or crafting. At the the very least, teams were given wood and tools to work with, so it wasn't as hard as it could have been. Next is the New Zealand Challenge. This was another challenge that mostly relied on a choice. They could either bungee jump off a bridge and catch a fish with their bare hands, or perform a traditional Maori dance. Much like the Ontario Challenge, one choice is certainly worse than the other, that being the bungee jumping. This activity may be fun for some and terrifying for others.
You go get that fish!
Either way, any team that chose this option was going to have a difficult time catching a slippery fish due to only having a few seconds near the water. There was also the possibility of accidentally catching an electric eel during their dive, and we're sure we don't have to tell you how painful touching one of those would be. As for the dancing challenge, the Maori dance doesn't have difficult choreography. It's challenging for anyone not skilled in dance, but there's a harder dance-related challenge later on in this list. Since this challenge wasn't balanced in choice difficulty, it loses some points, even if one of the options was tough. Working our way down under, we have the Australian Outback Challenge. Clear 10 rabbits from a farming field, use a glider to travel to the chill zone in New Zealand. Bunnies may be cute, but they're also hard to catch. Unless you're ennui, then you have to wait for them to come to you.
Your affection revolts me.
For the teams that aren't ennui, this challenge involved running around and falling over themselves. On the surface, it may not seem that bad. After all, there are multiple ways of catching bunnies, not all of them being too physically exhausting or draining. But even with strategy, catching animals as quick and cunning as a bunny is no easy task. This is also one of the few challenges that leads to an actual serious injury when Rock, from the Rockers, twists both his ankles after accidentally stepping into a rabbit burrow. You also have the Step Brothers, who get beaten up by a kangaroo after thinking it's the albino rabbit. Kangaroos weren't part of the challenge, but it's still worth acknowledging, as is the glider portion, where two teams got caught in an avalanche on their way to the chill zone. Who would have thought that a challenge that started with cute bunnies could actually be dangerous? Next is the Buenos Aires Challenge. Teams had to perform a traditional tango to receive their next tip. Afterwards, one of the teammates had to use a boleadora to tie up their team's emu and take it to the chill zone. Compared to the New Zealand Challenge, this dance challenge is more technical with a harsher judge, making it harder to complete. What comes afterwards is even harder. Trying to wrangle an animal as big and fast as an emu is already difficult, but having to do it using a tool that the contestants had likely never used before adds to the difficulty. We also have to acknowledge the danger in this challenge, from Kitty sliding down a mountain after she tackles her team's emu, to Devin getting knocked over a cliff by the sisters' emu after they lose control of it. The latter technically happened outside of the challenge, but it should be mentioned given just how seriously injured Devin was.
Will you be continuing with the race? No can do.
For the most part, this challenge was straightforward, relying more on skills and coordination, but it goes to show that you don't always need a twist on an obstacle to make it difficult. Lucky for us, next is the Las Vegas Challenge. Far away from the bright lights of the infamous Las Vegas Strip, teams had to either collect flags while riding on remote-controlled dune buggies in 1 minute, or perform a Vegas-style magic trick for a judge. Yet again, this is another challenge with choices that aren't balanced in danger or gruesomeness.
You actually look good in that thing.
Being out in the deserts of Nevada, crashing a dune buggy would still hurt, but it wouldn't hurt as much as crashing it on pavement or crashing into a tree. Since the rider wasn't allowed to actually steer, leaving that up to their partner, we can still consider it difficult. The magic option is still the more brutal one, because teams have to work with a lion that can maul them. In fact, a few of the team members do get mauled. Poor jocks. The only thing saving them from this fate would be if their partner performed the trick perfectly on the first try, which is something none of the teams do. Not too surprising, since magicians have to practice for years on tricks like this. While the dune buggies option still brings it down, it's hard to beat the gruesomeness that's possible when working with a lion. Next is the Vietnam Challenge. Unique to only this challenge, a 3-team super team had to work together to catch 6 catfish using a noodling method, which is kinda gross. If one of these fish had the Zip It ticket, their teams were able to go directly to the chill zone. If not, they had to traverse trap-filled war tunnels until they found a Don box, which would provide them with a map to the exit. While there is strength in numbers, catching fish in any fashion is difficult. Although a team could get lucky by finding the Zip It, that doesn't take away from the challenge of actually catching it.
Count 'em up. 6 catfish.
When we say trap-filled tunnel, we mean it. Like Indiana Jones-style traps, complete with giant boulders. Had any of the teams been caught in any of the traps, they would have been seriously injured, if not killed. And that's not even mentioning all the bats and spiders that can also be found in these caves. For that risk alone, we felt we had to give it a fairly high ranking, despite the easy out that half of the teams had. Moving on, we had the Beijing Challenge. With this one, we begin a eating challenge trifecta. Following a skydive into the Bird's Nest Stadium, one team member had to eat exotic and gross animals, such as worms and scorpions on a skewer, and deep fry it for their partner to eat. Afterwards, whoever didn't eat had to travel to the Great Wall of China while pulling their partner on a rickshaw. We don't think anyone would argue that the middle portion of this challenge was by far the most difficult and grossest. If you're someone like Carrie, who's had trauma involving worms, being forced to eat it and a bunch of other disgusting stuff can be brutal. The other two parts have their risk and difficulties. For example, Jocks broke his ankle during his and Josie's skydive landing. Skydiving can be dangerous and even scary for those who are afraid of heights. Getting knocked off course by a gust of wind can make things more difficult. Traveling a structure as big and long as the Great Wall can involve a lot of running and hiking, which could make the teammate who ate all the disgusting food sick. Together, these 3 separate portions make for a harsh challenge. Next is the Alberta Challenge. Teams had to eat an entire pot of pork and beans to receive the tip at the bottom. Then, one teammate had to ride a mechanical bull for 8 seconds. While we said that she was one of the worst characters in our previous Redonkulous race video, we unfortunately have to side with Stephanie on this one. Pork and beans, kinda gross. Even if you like pork and beans, which, no shame if you do, being forced to speed eat a pot of them, kinda rough. If you only have to eat half of it while your partner eats the other half, that's still a lot of pork and beans.
Get your own pot!
And again, this is a race, so you gotta eat them fast, and you can't even take breaks. Chances are, you're gonna have a stomach ache afterwards. And if you're the unlucky contestant who has to ride the mechanical bull afterwards, oh boy, while 8 seconds may not seem like that long, it can feel like an eternity when you're trying not to lose your grip or your lunch. A few contestants got injured in this one due to getting bucked off the bull, and even if you don't get bucked, there's still a chance of you getting motion sickness. It's not impossible if you have an iron stomach like MacArthur or experience with riding mechanical bulls, but we figured that most people would have a tough time. We can't forget about the Iceland Challenge. Wrapping up the last of our eating trifecta, contestants had to start this challenge by playing a game of Icelandic telephone. They'd have to listen to Don speaking Icelandic on a speaker box and then run through a field of hot geysers, making it to a local who they would have to accurately repeat the message to. Mess up and they would be forced to run back to the speaker box to hear the message again.
You gotta admit, your language is pretty darn ridiculous.
Afterwards, they would have to either eat a traditional Icelandic feast filled with things like goat eyes and organs, or search and retrieve a fossil in the ice caves. This challenge involves more than eating, but eating still plays a part. Both choices, as well as the first portion of the challenge, are the hardest part that we've seen so far. Trying to remember a phrase correctly isn't difficult when it's in a language you know, but making it a foreign language and then forcing contestants to remember it while dodging boiling hot geysers ups the difficulty factor. We're sure we don't have to tell you guys how disgusting it would be to eat the feast, but unlike previous challenges, the other choice may not be as gross, but it's still brutal. If you chose to do fossils, not only would you be working with heavy tools and ice, but you would have to actually find a fossil and get it out without breaking it, which could be time-consuming. You'd probably have sore arms too. Like we said, this is one of the few challenges where both choices are brutal. Add in a few dozen geysers and you've got a good starting point for the last third of our list, as well as one of the toughest challenges in the series.
Tell my parents I lived a good life!
Following is the Mediterranean Challenge. Taking place on a sunny beach, one teammate had to retrieve a travel tip from the dorsal fin of a great white shark. It wouldn't be total drama without killer sharks, nor would the series be complete without contestants getting roughed up by them.
If you swim into a shark's mouth,
You just keep on swimming.
We're ranking this a few slots above the Vegas challenge, since, while they both involve killer wild animals, the contestants in this challenge had to interact with sharks, while in the other challenge, they could choose dune buggies instead. Afterwards, the contestants had to build a sandcastle, although not just any sandcastle. It had to be a replica of the Castle of Versailles, so a little bit harder. Even if the Castle of Versailles doesn't have any big towers or complicated features, having to get all the details perfect while working with a material as fragile and finicky as sand is no easy task. While the shark portion pushed its level of gruesomeness, the latter half of this challenge isn't a walk in the park either. Moving on to the Siberia challenge. Contestants had to ice sail to the next challenge site in their bathing suits and in Siberia, which has Januaries that can get as cold as -13 degrees on average. Ooh, that's cold, baby. It's also dangerous if you're competing with teams who try to mess with your boat's brakes or try to ram you off course.
Let's just say the cadets can't catch a break.
Afterwards, teams had to work together to collect the ball at the bottom of an underground cavern that stretches 7 miles beneath the Earth's crust. One teammate has to work the crank that brings their partner up and down, while the other has to take a deep, dark dive. The ball collecting part of the challenge isn't too bad, but 7 miles is still a long way down, or a fast way down if you're Sanders. This is another challenge where someone broke a bone, and this isn't a gag injury either. Sanders wears a cast for the rest of the season, and sounds of pain she makes after she breaks her arm are realistic.
My arm is broken!
Although the injury was due to MacArthur's recklessness and not the challenge, it still makes the whole thing more gruesome. Broken bones aside, we're sure that being lowered down into a 7-mile-long hole would make anyone nervous, even at a slow and safe speed. Having to constantly turn the crank and keep control of it for your partner's sake can't be easy either. After how rough this one was, it's no wonder the chill zone is in a sauna. Next is the New York City Challenge. In this big season finale challenge, the final 3 had to drive to the Empire State Building and collect a briefcase at the top before racing to the midpoint chill zone at Central Park. Afterwards, the final 2 had to search for the combination of the briefcase on buoys located in a pond and race to the final chill zone. This challenge is all about endurance and speed. Similar to the Ontario Challenge, the teams had to climb a ton of stairs, 86 flights, to reach the top of the Empire State Building. The teams also had to deal with frustrating New York City traffic.
Get over yourself and honk like a normal person.
The rest of the challenge doesn't get easier, from trying to find the right boathouse to figuring out the combination on their suitcase. This is the final challenge, so it feels more intense. Even if it may not be the hardest, we felt it deserved a decent ranking. In the number 5 most gruesome spot, we have the Dubai Challenge. Contestants had to either return a serve from the world's toughest tennis launcher or wash an entire column of windows on the Burj Al Arab. Afterwards, they had to race to the Gold Souk Mall. This is another pick your poison. Would you rather try to do something that's nearly impossible, like trying to beat a robot in a sport, or would you rather do something dangerous and time-consuming? The height factor gives the latter choice more of a risk, considering that Kitty and Emma nearly fell off their platform. And if it weren't for Owen and Noah saving them, they would have been injured. On the other hand, a few of the contestants that chose tennis took a couple of hard hits too. However, what brings this challenge down is that after the tennis robot is knocked off the building, it's easy to beat, making that choice's challenge factor null and void. Granted, no one could have predicted an easy out, but it still happened and always had a slim chance of happening, given that they were on a roof and the robot wasn't protected. So we're still factoring it in. Next is the Darjeeling Challenge. What's worse than intense cold? How about extreme humidity? Contestants had to each fill a basket with tea leaves and hand it to a local to receive their next travel tip. Afterwards, they had to ride the Darjeeling Express. Whoever was lucky enough to get into the front cart was able to enjoy the rest of the ride, while the other contestants had to fight through carts full of animals if they wanted to reach the front cart, where they have a better chance of getting to the chill zone first. The first half of this challenge was not easy. The killer Darjeeling humidity made it hard to focus and work fast, and the tea leaves were so small that filling up an entire basket would take forever. Then, with the train, thanks to interference from the ice dancers, the other contestants had an even harder time getting to the station.
You thought I wouldn't notice the rest of the train is missing?
Dealing with goats and bulls and having to race on foot. If the ice dancers hadn't interfered, this challenge would still be hard, given that challengers would have to deal with barn animals. But it wouldn't be as hard, so we had to lower its ranking. We finally reached our top 3, starting with the Brazil Challenge. After arriving in Brazil, one teammate had to retrieve a travel tip from a mitt full of bullet ants. Afterwards, teams had to cross a gorge by any means necessary. Once on the other side, they then had to find the next travel tip hidden in a pile of coconuts. The final part of this challenge had the teams make a Brazilian carnival costume, which is the only fun and easy part of this challenge. Yeah, so bullet ants, brutal and painful.
Ow.
Don't be so dramatic.
Poor Lori even takes bullet ants to the face. Ouch! Trying to get across a gorge while dealing with that pain isn't easy either, and those teams who fail fall down a ravine and have to climb back up to try again. Thankfully, once the teams make it across the gorge, that's where the gruesomeness of this challenge ends, hence why it's only in 3rd place. Having to hammer open coconuts may be annoying, but it isn't hard or painful, unless you're getting hit by them. As for the costume portion, while the added detailing and the specifications of it needing to look like a traditional carnival costume would mean that you couldn't slap on feathers and call it a day, it wouldn't be too difficult, just time consuming. But if one half of this challenge is more brutal than the other, you could argue the entire challenge is still a struggle to get through, requiring a high pain tolerance, good upper body strength, luck, and crafting creativity. Getting the silver is the Arctic Circle Challenge. One partner must find a ring in the snow and toss it onto the tusk of a narwhal. Afterwards, they will need to race to the next location and build an igloo from the snow and ice. While not as painful as bullet ants, this challenge is the best example of the race testing the patience, endurance, and determination of its contestants. Regular ring toss games are already tricky, but trying to ring a narwhal, which can move its head or dive back under the water, is difficult. Having to do it in the Arctic cold doesn't make things easier, and even if you have a good aim and arm, the other factors would still make this portion of the challenge tough.
That was pure luck, but we don't have to tell them that.
In the next part of the challenge, contestants would have to carve hard snow and ice for as long as it took to make an igloo. The igloo also had to be stable and accurate to an actual igloo that someone could live in, meaning that it would take precision, strategy, and speed. With all the skills required to make it through this challenge, let alone get a top spot in the race, we just had to rank it near the top of our list. Finally, we've reached what we consider to be the hardest and most gruesome challenge, the Indonesia Challenge. Lions, sharks, bullet ants, and how about a dragon? Contestants had to get a vial of Komodo dragon saliva from real Komodo dragons. For those not in the know, Komodo dragons are deadly. Not only do you have to avoid getting mauled by one, you also have to avoid getting poisoned. A Komodo dragon can use venom to kill whatever prey it wishes within only a few hours.
Freeze, you glorified iguanas!
The challenge is all about collecting saliva, which isn't just gross, but also contains the venom. So all the contestants were in danger. Not only did they have to get close to the Komodo dragon, but they also had to figure out how to collect the drool safely without getting bitten or attacked. It nearly happened several times in the episode, with the Goths being the only team that's not really in any danger due to the musk that they were wearing. Everyone else is on the struggle bus. At one point, 5 different contestants are chased up a tree, which is treated by the characters as a life or death situation. You'd think this would be more than enough for a challenge, but no. After getting the saliva, they had to find a special redonkulous rug out of a massive pile of rugs. Maybe not as deadly as Komodo dragons, but there's still danger. Noah is buried under rugs at one point. The rug hunt is also time-consuming and frustrating. Trying to lift and unroll a full-size rug would be a lot harder than searching through coconuts or maps. If this portion was as easy as eating cake, it still wouldn't take away from the intensity and danger of the first half of this challenge. With that being said, we're happy to give the Indonesia Challenge the title of Most Gruesome. Alright, what do you think? Let us know in the comment section what Redonkulous Race Challenge you think would be the worst to experience. Make sure to hit that notification bell and binge more of our total drama videos, but most importantly, stay wicked.